You'll want to avoid the droid on NES Works Gaiden episode 51. This episode sees 3 games based around the concept of shooting things with robots in space, all of which debuted in the span of about a week in December of 1985. dbSoft's Volguard II kicks things off. Not only does Volguard II jumpstart this brief robot shooter dalliance, it also cements the unfortunate fact that Famicom's salad days are over. We've seen more and more works of questionable quality pushing in at the edges over the past few months. But here, the dam has officially burst. Even more disappointingly, it's not as though this week's tawdry trio comes to us from a new, untested publisher. dbSoft had been around for a few years by this point, publishing games on Japanese home computers like Sharp X1 and NEC's PC-88 range. And they'd even enjoyed a minor hit on Famicom over the summer with Flappy. So there's really no excusing Volguard II, which, like Flappy, descends from dbSoft's computer heritage. However, where Flappy presented a direct computer-to-console conversion, Volguard II dares to be the sequel to a shooter called, yes, Volguard. Volguard belonged to that immense rush of 1984 releases that aimed to capitalize on the transforming mecha and robot craze in Japan. 1984 also saw the debut of the Transformers property, which had reworked Takara's Microman Diaclone toy line for the West. A big part of Transformers' success had to do with its cartoon, which Marvel commissioned its Sunbow Productions animation studio to create. A joint venture between Marvel, Hasbro, and advertising firm Griffin Bacall, Sunbow in turn brought on a variety of Japanese and Korean animation studios including Toei, Acom, and Anime R. This made Transformers technically anime, and the show's airing in Japan helped bolster a massive wave of transforming robot mania. Heck, Japanese kids would eventually get more Transformer cartoons than we saw in the US. Anyway, this zeitgeist extended way beyond Transformers and into a massive rush of video games that attempted to convert the trends of toys and television into video game form. By this point, Famicom fans already had Jaleco's Formation Z, and SG-1000 owners had Orgus. And PC-88 fans had Volguard, among others, including GameArt's Thexter, which we'll discuss soon enough. All games in which you could control a transforming spaceship. Volguard stood apart from the rest of the transforming robot games of the era, by also leaning into shows like Mobile Suit Gundam, Space Runaway Ideon, and Beast King Go Lion, with the inclusion of a component-based mechanic. Rather than simply allowing you to transform your ship at will, Volguard required you to first collect a number of components that would amplify your firepower. Only once you had gathered 2 additional companion devices could you switch Volguard from fighter to robot mode. It's a variant of the concept Nichibutsu explored in Magmax. By all accounts, though, the transformation function fell afoul of the usual shenanigans that dog games like this. Your humanoid mech form moves much more slowly than a jet fighter, and in a horizontal shooter, it presents a much larger target profile. So making the transformation bogs down the action, it makes the game way harder. Volguard II attempts to streamline the system by only forcing you to acquire a single component before you can effect the transformation instead of 2. It does not, however, make the mech form more useful. Rather than focus on enhancing the playability and appeal of the robot mechanics for Volguard II, the developers at dbSoft instead integrated a strange and overly complicated energy system into the game. Your ship has 2 energy meters at the top of the screen, and the lengthy energy bar along the top does not represent your life. Instead, you glean that information by peeking at the upper right-hand corner of the screen, where a number rises from 0 to 99 as you take damage. Once it exceeds 99, you explode, regardless of what that long energy bar indicates. The other bar depicts your ship's combat energy, which has the basic function of determining whether or not you can shoot at foes. It also incorporates a bunch of other rules. On a basic level, your ship's energy drains when you shoot and recovers slightly when you destroy an enemy. However, collecting various items during combat will cause the energy meter to become segmented, which can result in you collecting alternate weapons and determines the results yielded by the friendly carrier that appears at the top of the screen to dock with you from time to time. I honestly couldn't figure out precisely how this system works, and ultimately, I don't think it matters. It's a grindingly repetitive game in which every level plays the same as the last. About all it has going for it is the novelty of the robot transformation, and the fact that it plays more like Konami's Scramble or Super Cobra than anything else on the system. When you fire at foes, you also launch a bomb forward that can strike ground-based targets. Some terrestrial emplacements will fire at you, but really the air-to-ground strikes are primarily useful for the bonus energy meter refills they provide. You fight through wave after wave of enemy, defeat a boss, and then do the exact same thing all over again. Volguard II seemingly has a reputation for becoming impossibly difficult, beginning with level 4, though it reportedly contains something like 24 levels. It's hard to imagine wanting to grind through these same enemy formations dozens of times, but let's not forget that Famicom was primarily targeted to kids who didn't have full-time jobs and usually got stuck playing the one game they had access to. You go to the store and spend your full allowance on the game that has the coolest robot on the cover, and you force yourself to learn to love the lump of mediocrity you've inflicted upon yourself. Thanks dbSoft, thanks to Volguard II, being a kid was the worst. Then again, you have to wonder how many kids actually bought Volguard II, because just a few days later, it was eclipsed by the release of this, a game based on the great-granddaddy of all transforming mecha anime shows, Super Dimension Fortress Macross, or Chojiku Yosai Makurosu, if you're nasty. The Super Dimension Fortress Macross anime debuted in Japan in 1982, combining a whole lot of different trends all at once. You had the ongoing groundswell of enthusiasm for transforming robots, which would properly explode into the mainstream in 1984 with Transformers. You had a little bit of romance, of military action, and alien conquest. Macross was basically a hybrid of space battleship Yamato, Mobile Suit Gundam, Star Wars, and a soap opera. The plot centered on a young man named Hikaru Ichijo, Rick Hunter in the American adaptation, who found himself thrust into a key role in a massive war for humanity's survival. Like Gundam's Amuro Ray, Hikaru never wanted to become a soldier, but he had a keen aptitude for piloting the good guy's uniquely capable fighter craft. In this case, a spaceborne jet fighter based on America's F-14 and F-15 designs that, unlike its real-world counterparts, could transform into a humanoid Gundam-esque mecha. Hikaru also found himself at the center of a different conflict off the battlefield, a love triangle with his commanding officer Mise Hayase, or Lisa Hayes, and a winsome, up-and-coming pop idol sensation named Lin Minmay. Although Macross never quite explored the weighty themes that define Gundam, it nevertheless dealt with topics like the loss of a loved one, alcoholism, and also the eradication of the vast majority of humankind as a result of an alien genocide. Anyway, Macross was the first of several aesthetically similar anime series by different combinations of Big West, Studio Nue, Artland, and Tatsunoko. When it came to the US via Harmony Gold, the producers combined it with two of those other shows, Super Dimension Cavalry Southern Cross and Genesis Climber Mospeada, into a single multi-generational saga called Robotech. The fourth show, Super Dimension Century Orgus, failed to make the cut, probably because its focus on nomadic cat people didn't really gel with Macross. Or maybe they were just worried about the legalities of all the Emerson, Lake and Palmer album art that kept showing up in backgrounds. Anyway, Macross went on to inspire a variety of sequels and spin-offs, and it helped influence a ridiculous number of sci-fi concepts ranging from the Transformers Jetfire to Japan's idol singer trend. Needless to say, it also served as the basis for many video games, beginning with this one. Unfortunately, this isn't really the strongest start. I can't seem to find firm details on who actually developed this game, but it arrived as a joint publishing venture between Bandai and Namco, strangely enough. I doubt either company handled the nuts and bolts of development, as Namco consistently worked to a higher standard, and Bandai lacked internal game production staff. So this is just one of those anonymous, mysterious disasters. Macross for Famicom puts you in control of a transforming Valkyrie space fighter, which can shift between three forms: jet, humanoid, and the awkward in-between mode known as Gerwalk. Each of these forms has distinct advantages and disadvantages, but unsurprisingly, you will almost always find yourself sticking to the basic jet mode, since it's the closest thing the game can offer to fun. The android mode, per usual, presents a large target that moves slowly, meaning that you'll suffer more damage and end up with a game over whenever you transform. Then again, a game over seems like something of a mercy here. This is very rudimentary, by-the-numbers horizontal shooting. Macross deserves kudos for managing to capture the look of the show about as well as you could expect given the limitations of the hardware, with all the mech recognizably resembling their anime counterparts and a constant burst of explosions detonating in the background. It even has a little Minmay figure who hits a gong to begin each stage, just like in the in-show video game. But you never do anything interesting here. You fly left to right through space, avoiding enemies and mines, blowing up targets, and minimizing the damage you absorb, until you reach a Zentradi battle fortress. Then you enter the fortress and fight your way through to its core, which you then destroy. That's fine, but every single level works exactly like this, and the format doesn't take long to wear out its welcome. Macross desperately needs some sort of variety to liven it up. Even a battle set inside the human refuge ship The eponymous city in a battle cruiser Super Dimension Fortress Macross could have provided a nice change of pace. Or even better, sequences where you pilot the Macross itself in combat, or anything besides the endless repetitive slog of monotony that embodies this game, like all the other shooters in this episode. If you like hitting buttons over and over again, and pointlessly dodging tiny projectiles, maybe you can find some entertainment in Macross. Just don't switch into humanoid form, it's the worst. Thanks Bandai and Namco for sucking the fun out of being a humanoid. And we wrap this episode with another game from dbSoft, Zunou Senan Galg. Although it looks and plays differently than Volguard II, it is equally mediocre and every bit as tedious. Unlike Volguard II, Gaulk bears an external development credit on its title screen for one Team Biotechers. This appears to be the only game this team ever created, and I can find literally no information about them online besides they created Gaulk. So I have no interesting historical anecdotes to share with you about this. Gaulk takes the form of a very traditional top-down shooter. Probably compare it most closely to Star Force or Alpha Mission in that you really only have a single form of offense and don't need to target ground-based enemies with a distinct weapon or attack. At the same time, you need to collect a power-up in order to complete the game. This serves as the basis for Gaulk, and it transforms a simple shooter into a grueling, hours-long marathon. Gaulk requires you to collect 100 parts, or power-ups, which is to say a distinctive icon that does nothing in terms of gameplay, in order to square off against the final boss. That's all well and good, but here's the rub. You can only collect one part per level. Yes, this means you have to complete 100 stages in order to see the end of the game. Each stage takes a couple of minutes to shoot through, which means that a complete playthrough will take around 3 hours or so. Those 3 hours will consist of utterly mind-numbing repetition. You see, Zuno Senan Galg only contains 30 stages in total. Once you reach the final stage, you'll have to return to the start and begin again in order to gather the rest of the pieces you need. Oh, but it gets worse. Those 30 levels don't actually unfold in a linear fashion. The first half of the stages actually branch, kind of like the ones in Section Z or Darius. So that when you complete level 1, you have to choose whether to veer left to level 2 or right to level 3. If you pick level 2, you can go on from there to level 4 or 5, and so on. Once you complete these branching stages, you move along to a battle fortress and then to a space sequence, both of which do adopt a linear format. But realistically, you can only complete about 20 stages in a single run, which means you'll need to play through the game 5 or 6 times in order to collect 100 parts. Meanwhile, the game actively trolls you as you near your goal. There are warps in Area 30 that will send you back to the beginning of the game, even if you have all 100 items. Worse, there's supposedly a collectible that appears in the final stage that will delete all of the items you've acquired so far if you don't have 100 on hand already. It's just unbelievably cruel. And it's not as though there's any real variety within the stages. They all play more or less the same with slightly differing degrees of difficulty. And of course you need to be on the lookout for those 100 parts. But for the most part it's just an endless slog of shooting the same enemies across repetitive stage designs before jumping back to the start and doing it all over again and again and again. In summary, thank you Team Biotechers for calling it a day after creating Zuno Senan Galg. Next time on NES Works Gaiden, war. What's it good for?